On the morning of August 12, 1970, a young man named Lawrence Hallahan drove along a coastal road in County Cork, Ireland. Out the car window to his right, he could see an area called Towhead Bay, which was a shoreline with a lot of really cool rock formations that also led out to the Atlantic Ocean. People came from all over Ireland to see Towhead Bay. But for Lawrence, the incredible view was just part of his daily commute, so he really wasn't paying much attention to it. However, as he's driving along, out of the corner of his eye, he sees something unusual floating in the water out in Towhead Bay. And he looks and he sees it was a sailboat, which was really odd, not because, boats don't go in the water, they do, but in Towhead Bay, people just didn't sail out there because it was just not safe. There was lots of rocks. This is not a place where you sail a boat. But then Lawrence, as he's driving along, sort of glancing out at the sailboat, he remembered this story that had been all over the news recently. It was about the 66-year-old retired naval officer named Edward Neal who had gone missing at sea. A few months ago, Edward had set off in his personal sailboat, which was called the Monaveen, on a journey from England to the Isle of Man. Now, the route was a very simple straight shot that should have only taken about 36 hours to complete, but Edward had never arrived at his destination. His family had ultimately reported him missing, and the Coast Guard had been searching for his boat ever since. But so far, they hadn't found it anywhere. And so his disappearance had become this huge mystery, because it really just didn't make any sense. Number one, there hadn't been any serious storms in the area where he was going to be, and so it was just unlikely that his boat was, damaged or he was blown off course or something. But then two, let's say something did happen. Let's say there was an emergency, his boat was damaged, or he was blown off course, or something else happened. He was an expert sailor, an expert mariner. He was ready to handle practically any emergency at sea. But then even more, had something happened, and had he been overwhelmed, and even he couldn't handle it, he never made any distress calls. Not once. There was no distress calls from him at all, period. But now, as Lawrence looked out at the boat floating in Towhead Bay, which was hundreds of miles away from Edward's planned route, he saw the name on the boat. It said Monaveen, painted right on the side. It was Edward's. And so Lawrence's heart began to race, he couldn't believe that he had just found this. How is nobody else seeing this? And so without really thinking much about it, Lawrence parked his car, hopped out, and literally just ran down to the shore to go investigate further, to get a better look at the Monaveen. And so Lawrence, he carefully made his way across a bunch of slippery rocks until he finally reached the edge of the water. And the Monaveen really wasn't that far out into the water. It was floating maybe 3 or 4 yards away. And so, without even taking his shoes or anything off, Lawrence just leapt into the water and started swimming out to the boat. It only took him a few seconds to reach the boat, and when he did, he pulled himself up onto the deck. And once he was up there, Lawrence looked around and didn't see any obvious damage. But there also didn't seem like there was any signs of recent activity. So he just began calling out over and over, is anybody here? Anybody on board? But there was no response. It seemed like Edward must have at some point abandoned his boat. So Lawrence just began exploring, figuring there must have been some kind of problem on board, which must have caused Edward to have left it behind. And at this point, he didn't really feel like he was invading the guy's privacy because this was a huge news story. People were looking for him. And so Lawrence is like, maybe I can solve this mystery once and for all. And so Lawrence found his way to the helm of the boat, which is where the steering wheel is. And there, right beside the steering wheel, Lawrence saw a special type of two-way marine radio. And he just reached over and he pressed the on button. And to his shock, the radio turned on. The radio worked. And at this point, Lawrence felt a combination of confusion, of curiosity, and of just general unease. If the radio worked, why hadn't Edward just called for help? Lawrence saw there was an enclosed area in the center of the deck, which he knew must be where the boat's kitchen, the bathroom, and the bedroom were. So now, feeling a little bit nervous, he walked over, he found the door, and he pushed it open. And sure enough, Lawrence found himself standing inside the boat's kitchen. And the kitchen was very clean and also very well stocked. There were at least a dozen packages of biscuits along with a bunch of fresh water. There was tea, cocoa, powdered milk. And seeing all this made Lawrence even more confused, because why would Edward abandon an undamaged boat, at least so far it's undamaged, with a working radio and a bunch of food and water on board? However, when Lawrence walked from the kitchen into the bedroom area and saw what was in there, he realized that Edward had not abandoned his boat. Because right there, in the bed, was Edward, and he was dead. But it would turn out, once they found Edward's body, the mystery around what happened to him only got more bizarre. Because even though Edward had been missing for 3 months, An autopsy determined that he'd only been dead for about 1 month. But when Lawrence found him, Edward was so emaciated that he practically looked like a skeleton. He weighed just 62 pounds, and he had died of starvation. And so to this day, nobody has ever been able to explain where Edward was during those 2 months when the Coast Guard was searching for him and he wasn't dead yet. He was still alive. And why didn't he use his radio to call for help? And also, how did he starve to death when he was just a few steps away from a well-stocked kitchen? BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the morning of November 10th, 1982, a 54-year-old woman named Mary Kemp was sitting in her living room in Salisbury, Maryland, when her phone rang. She answered it, and she heard a voice that she instantly knew was her 35-year-old son, Don. And Mary smiled when he heard him. And she asked Don where he was and how he was doing. So for the past month, Don had been on this cross-country road trip. He was working on a book about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and to research it, he'd set out in his SUV to go visit a bunch of historical landmarks from the Civil War era. Now, since Don had set out on this trip, he had made a point to check in with his mother at least once a week to fill her in and let her know how it was going. And this morning, just from the tone of Don's voice, Mary could tell clearly it was still going great. And so, with the phone in hand, Mary walked over to the couch and she curled up and she listened as her son told her all about how he was now in Wyoming and he was planning to visit this Old West museum that was there in just a few days. Mary told him to keep it up and have a great time, and then before he hung up, he promised he would call her back in a few days. 6 days later, on the morning of November 16th, a highway patrolman was driving down a highway in Carbon County, Wyoming. Carbon County is located about 2,000 miles away from Mary's house in Maryland. This patrolman was basically out in the middle of nowhere, and through his windshield, all he could see were just open plains on either side, and everything was covered with a thick blanket of snow. But as the patrolman approached an exit ramp up ahead, he saw something that looked really out of place. There was an SUV just sitting on the exit ramp, just idling right in the middle of the road. Its doors were wide open, there were what appeared to be clothes scattered all over the road, sort of outside of this vehicle, and the car had a Maryland license plate. Now, clearly to the patrolman, something was wrong here. So he pulled over and he walked up to the SUV to make sure the driver was okay. But when he reached the vehicle and looked inside, because again, all the doors are open, there was nobody in there. But through the open doors, he noticed on the other side of the car, on the ground, were what appeared to be footprints, like a set of footprints. And so the patrolman walked around the car, being careful not to step on all the clothes that was out there. He goes to the other side and he sees clearly somebody climbed out of this vehicle on the passenger side, landed in the snow, and then he looked and the footprints, they wandered not along the road, but they go off the road, just out into the wilderness. An hour later, a Carbon County Sheriff's deputy was trudging through the snow following those footprints. He, along with several other deputies that he was with, had been sent out here specifically to follow these tracks and see where they went, see what happened to the driver of this SUV. This is so strange. Why would this person have gotten out like that and just wandered off? What's going on? And so these deputies, they're walking along, looking down, following this trail, and overhead they can hear the sound of a plane, because a plane had also been dispatched to fly overhead to see if they could spot this driver somewhere out in the wilderness. Now, this area, the area where the driver sort of walked off into, was so flat and so empty, it really should have been quite easy to spot anybody who was, wandering around in the snow. But on the ground, the deputy, along with all the others, they couldn't see anybody ahead of them. The footprints just kept on going past fields and random farmhouses, and overhead, the pilot, he hadn't seen anyone yet either. And so for the deputies on the ground, after following these tracks for 6 miles, they started to wonder, are these ever gonna end? What in the world was this person doing? Where were they going? But at about the 6-mile mark away from the highway, so away from the vehicle, the lead deputy, along with the others, they looked up ahead and they saw these tracks went right up to this big red barn off in the distance. That appeared to be the destination. And so now, moving with a bit of a purpose, because they're sensing they're about to, get to the end of this mystery here to see what happened to this driver, where they went, they began walking much faster and they followed the tracks right up to this barn. And where the tracks went into the barn was through this now closed door. But there were only prints going into the barn, and unless they exited the barn on the other side or something, it looked like they went into the barn and shut the door, and they're still inside of there. That was the initial impression. But when the lead deputy opened up that closed door and stepped inside, there was no one in there. It was clear that whoever had walked from the abandoned SUV to this barn had somehow left, but without leaving any new footprints in the snow, which literally should have been impossible. And so the lead deputy, he left the barn and just looked down at the prints that had led them there as if he was gonna learn something new. But actually, as he looked at these prints, which nobody else had stepped in, they had been very careful as they moved to this barn not to sully up the original prints, he noticed that some of the prints looked a little bit misshapen, almost like they had been stepped in more than once. And he got down closer and he began to realize that virtually all the prints that they had followed here were sort of misshapen. And so he began backtracking and he saw it the whole way. All these prints are like double prints. And so the only conclusion the lead deputy could come to, considering the prints stop at the barn and there's nobody in the barn, is that this driver, after walking 6 miles in the snow for reasons unknown to this barn, they must have left the barn and walked backwards, in reverse, in their original tracks, just back the way they came. And so the lead deputy and the others basically began walking the same tracks that brought them to the barn, but now in reverse, looking for maybe there's some point where it branches off and we just missed it. Maybe there's 1 or 2 steps that go off in a different direction, because no one walks 6 miles in reverse. And also, if that really happened, where is this person? But no, they followed the tracks all the way back to the car, and there were these duplicate prints in every one of them. So this person literally walked backwards for 6 miles, but then they're back at the car and they're where did they go? There's no other prints. There's nothing. Where are they? How is this even possible? That evening, investigators ran the abandoned SUV's license plate and learned that it belonged to a 35-year-old man named Don Kemp. Now, they couldn't get in touch with Don himself, but they did manage to get his mother, Mary, on the phone. And Mary told police that it actually did make sense that her son would be in Wyoming because he was on this big cross-country road trip. But she also said that she has no idea why he would have abandoned his car like that. And she said he had no history of mental illness, he wasn't taking any medications that could potentially disorient him, and he was just generally a really responsible guy. This didn't make sense to her at all. So the sheriff's department just went back to, searching the wilderness around where the car was found, looking for Don Kemp, searching the wilderness area, searching near the barn, looking everywhere. But despite searching on foot, with planes and even on horseback, another really serious push to find him, they didn't find anything new. And then on the 3rd day of this big search, a huge blizzard swept through the area and forced the search to stop. The investigators knew that if Don had still been alive and outside in the area, he almost certainly would have frozen to death during that blizzard. And if he'd left the area, then he probably had done so on purpose, and he didn't want to be found, which could explain why he'd apparently purposefully hidden his tracks when he had left the barn. So at the time of the blizzard, a decision was made not just to postpone the search, but actually to officially call it off. And then after the search ended, for months following it, Don Kemp's name remained in the news. His case was totally fascinating. It was so mysterious, nobody knew what happened to him, but eventually his case went totally cold. That is until April of 1983, so 5 months after Don disappeared. A woman in New York City received a very bizarre phone call. So this woman's name was Judy Aiello. And she actually knew Don personally because they had worked together for 10 years until Don actually went on to leave to go write his book, which entailed him eventually going off and, going missing. And so Judy was well aware of the fact that Don was missing and that the police were still basically looking for him, maybe not actively, but there was definitely an ongoing search for him. And she knew that so far nobody really knew anything. It was just this big mystery. And so with that as context, one day that April, Judy came home from work and she saw that she had a message on her answering machine. So she clicked the play button. And to her shock, the voice she heard that came out of this answering machine was Don Kemp's. All he said was, "I'd like to speak to you again. Call me." And then he gave the phone number to reach him at. And that was it. That was the whole message. But again, Judy had worked with him for 10 years. She's well aware of the fact that he's missing. Like, she knows this is him. And immediately she calls this phone number because pretty much like everybody else, the belief here was that Don was very likely dead. And now it's like, no, he's fine. He's just called me. He's good. I'm going to find out what happened to him. Everything's going to be fine. And so she calls back this number expecting to hear Don. But when somebody picks up, it is a man, but it's definitely not Don. And so Judy, she just said, "Hey, I'd like to speak to Don Kemp. Can you put me in touch with him? He gave me this number." And the man on the other end of the line, he was very nervous. And he really wasn't sure why she was calling. It was very uncomfortable for him. And at some point he was like, "Okay, I'll let you talk to Don." But then very quickly he was like, no, he's not here. And then Judy, she's like, "Well, it's really important that I talk to him. Can you please at least tell him that I returned his call and have him call me back?" And the man was like, "Oh, okay." And he took down her number and he's like, "Oh, I'll tell him." And then he hung up. And so Judy, she slowly lowered the receiver and put it back in the cradle. And her first thought was like, wow, that was really weird and also very disappointing. I really want to talk to Don. But then she was thinking, wait a minute, is this whole thing just a prank? Because after all, Don's disappearance has been all over the news and any random person could have heard about it and maybe, found out that she knew him. And it seemed like a really cruel thing to do, but it was possible. However, as she thought about that, she realized that no, this literally could not be a prank. And not just because she was completely certain that the voice on her answering machine had been Don's, but also because Judy's phone number was not listed in a phone book anywhere, which meant whoever placed the call and left that voicemail had to have known Judy personally. There was no other way to get that number. And so at that point, Judy realized it was not good enough to wait and hope that Don called her back. She had to go talk to the police. The next day, almost 2,000 miles away from New York City, where Judy had reported the bizarre phone call to the police, a police captain in Casper, Wyoming, knocked on the door of a trailer. So this captain, whose name was Mark Benton, had found out that the phone call Judy had received that she reported to police had been traced to this address in Wyoming, to this trailer. And this address was actually only about a 2-hour drive from the location where Don Kemp's abandoned SUV was found 5 months earlier. Benton already knew that this trailer belonged to a man named Mark Dennis. So when the door opened and Benton saw a man standing there, he asked, "Are you Mark Dennis?" And the man nodded and said, "Yes." So at that point, Captain Benton explained that he was there to investigate a phone call that had been traced back to this address, and that this phone call was potentially connected to the disappearance of a man named Don Kemp. But Mark just sort of stared back at Benton with a look of total confusion on his face. And then he said he didn't know anything about a phone call to New York and that he had never even heard of a Don Kemp. Now, Benton was not totally buying this because the idea that this guy, lives 2 hours away from where Don went missing and it was all over the news, 5 months ago and still is on the news pretty regularly. The idea that you had never heard of this guy, it was just a little bit fishy. And so we asked Mark if he'd be willing to come take a polygraph. And to his surprise, Mark said, sure. A couple of days later, Benton was sitting in his office at the sheriff's department and he called Mark to schedule his polygraph. But Mark didn't answer the phone. So Benton left him a voicemail. And then a little while later, Benton got a call back. But it was not from Mark. It was from his new attorney, who said Mark would no longer be speaking to the police any further about this topic. A few weeks later, and another 2,000 miles away, Don's mother, Mary Kemp, sat in her home in Maryland, clutching the phone to her ear as Captain Benton gave her an update on her son's case. So Mary knew about the phone call Judy had received, which actually had been followed by several more calls, all from the same number. Judy never actually answered these calls. They all went to voicemail. They all sounded like Don. The messaging was very similar. It's like, I want to talk to you, call me back. But she was never able to actually connect with Don. Judy wasn't. And so for Mary, she was convinced that the answer to her son's disappearance must have something to do with Mark Dennis, because he was the guy who owned the trailer where all these calls were coming from, and he's lawyered up instead of taking his polygraph. Like, it must have to do with him. What other solution could there be here? Like, he must be involved. He has to be. But now, as part of his update to Mary, Captain Benton was telling her that Mark Dennis had outright denied knowing her son. And because Mark was not officially a suspect, they didn't have any concrete evidence against him, and he wasn't talking because he had lawyered up, the police were not planning to investigate him any further. And Mary, when she heard this, was genuinely stunned. I mean, those calls from Mark's trailer were the only clue that anybody had found in months, and she just couldn't understand why the investigators weren't looking into this more seriously. From day one, she had felt like Dawn's disappearance was at the bottom of the sheriff department's priority list. They'd called off the search after only a few days, and now they'd barely looked into the only suspect they had, who again lawyered up as soon as he was asked to take a polygraph test. Like, what is that? And so Mary wasn't sure if, these investigators were just incompetent or what, but she knew that at this point, there was only one thing she could do. She was going to fly out to Wyoming, and she was going to investigate her son's disappearance herself. A few weeks later, a very agitated Mary Kemp barged into the Carbon County Sheriff's Office in Wyoming, which was the law enforcement agency that originally investigated Dawn's disappearance. She walked right up to the front desk, identified herself, and demanded to see all the files on her son's case. The clerk looked a little bit taken aback by the way Mary was acting, but she nodded and then got up and went into the back of the office, and about a minute later, she came back with a file folder. And so she hands it over to Mary. Mary grabs it. She walks over to a nearby chair. She sits down. She opens up this file folder, and she begins flipping through all the evidence that had been collected so far. And Mary very quickly realized that there was way more to this story than the investigators had told her. Because as she looked at photos of her son's car from where it had been found on the highway when it was abandoned, she realized that it didn't actually look like her son had just stopped at random, gotten out, and walked off like the police had said. No, his car looked like it had been struck. So the mirror on the passenger side of the car was broken, and a gasket had been ripped off the door. So the gasket is the rubber sealing around the rim of the door so that when it shuts, it seals. Well, part of it had been ripped off the door. And also the key, which was still in the ignition when the car was found, was completely bent in half. And so to Mary, based on these photos, it immediately seemed obvious, at least to her, that her son did not just pull over and walk off. He must have been forced off the side of the road. Maybe somebody struck his car and, maybe they drove off, but maybe the impact of the strike had disoriented her son and it caused him to wander off. Or maybe somebody intentionally ran him off the road and then forced him, grabbed him and dragged him out of the car and let him off somewhere. But then also Mary's thinking, well, if there was another person who got out of their vehicle, where are their prints? Because there was only one set of prints, my son's. Or was that my son's prints? Are those his prints? She didn't know. And so it was just totally confounding. But Mary realized even if there was somebody else that sort of caused her son to go missing, somebody who ran him off the road or who grabbed him and pulled him out or whatever, overlooking all the facts, which are like, where are their footprints and why isn't there another car that we found that ran into him? Forget all that. Mary realized if there were other people involved, it was going to be nearly impossible to figure out who they were. Because for reasons she just could not understand, the investigators had not fingerprinted her son's car when it was found, and they hadn't made casts of the footprints in the snow. So there was no way to prove if anyone besides Dawn had been in the car, or if Dawn was even the one who made those tracks in the snow. And so any forensic evidence that could have maybe helped solve this case was now long gone. So if Mary wanted to find her son, she basically had to start from scratch. Over the next few weeks, Mary Kemp stayed in Wyoming and conducted her own investigation. She tracked down Mark Dennis, the man from the trailer where those bizarre phone calls had originated, and she actually spoke to him on the phone. However, just like he had with the police, Mark denied knowing anything about Dawn or those phone calls, and when Mary accused him of lying, he just hung up. Mary visited all the places she could think of where Dawn might have gone to. She also spoke to workers at the museums and other locations where she knew her son had been planning to go as part of his research for his book. She hired a private investigator, she put up posters with a reward for information, and she even went to a psychic for help. But basically, nothing worked. She got nowhere until finally, she got one meaningful lead. Through her investigation, Mary learned that apparently in April of 1983, around the time Judy got those strange phone calls, 2 people had seen a man who matched Dawn's description in Casper, which was the same town where Mark Dennis's trailer was. One was a bartender at a local tavern who remembered serving Dawn, and the other was someone who remembered seeing him at a traveling exhibit about Abraham Lincoln. And remember, the whole reason Dawn was even out there to begin with was to research Abraham Lincoln, so Mary thought that sighting at least had to be credible. I mean, it would be a pretty crazy coincidence if Dawn just happened to have a perfect doppelganger in Casper, Wyoming, who also happened to love Abraham Lincoln. However, by the time Mary actually learned about these sightings, it had been at least a full month since the actual sightings occurred, and now it seemed like if Dawn really had been in Casper, he wasn't anymore. Mary didn't find any other trace of her son there, or any clues as to where he might have gone next. I mean, the whole situation was so weird that Mary literally couldn't form a coherent theory about what might have happened to her son. In fact, the more Mary thought about it, the less sense any of this made. And so basically, she just reached a total dead end and eventually gave up and went back home to Maryland. And for the next 2 years, Mary continued not to get any answers about her son. But then, on October 4th of 1985, so almost 3 years after Dawn disappeared, everything changed. That day, a group of hunters were hiking through the woods in Carbon County, Wyoming, when one of them looked up ahead and they saw what looked like a bunch of white rocks lying in the grass. And so these hunters, they moved up to get a better look at these rocks. And as they got closer, they realized they were definitely not rocks, they were bones. And in fact, as they got close enough, they saw it was not just a couple of bones, it was like a perfectly intact human skeleton just lying in the grass, still wearing clothes, but just bones inside the clothes. When sheriff's investigators arrived on the scene, they found a wallet that was inside the skeleton's pants pocket. And in that wallet, there was a driver's license with the name Dawn Kemp. An autopsy found that Dawn had died of exposure, and there was no sign of foul play. The sheriff department's official conclusion was that on the day he disappeared, Dawn must have suffered a mental breakdown and walked into the wilderness voluntarily, and then at some point he had died, likely in that blizzard that happened 3 days later. Now, this sounds like a neat and tidy explanation, but really it only raises more questions. Because Dawn's body was found only 4 miles away from where his car was abandoned. Investigators had searched that area for days, and even if Dawn had been trying to hide from the search teams for whatever reason, this area was so bare and so flat that there really was nowhere to hide. And so it's just hard to imagine that Dawn was basically right there the whole time and nobody saw him. But then even if Dawn really had somehow died in the blizzard 3 days after his car was found, and despite all this search effort, he was never located, let's pretend that actually happened, well, who made those phone calls from Mark Dennis's trailer 5 months later to Judy? Who was that? And also, how had he been spotted by 2 different people walking around the same town where those calls came from? And if there really was no foul play involved, why was Dawn's car so weirdly damaged when it was found? Who did that? The Carbon County Sheriff's Department was never able to answer any of those questions. And so Mary Kemp, when she died in 2014, died still wondering what really happened to her son. If mysterious deaths that leave behind more questions than answers are your kind of story, then you should really check out another episode of ours on Ricky